Hi, welcome to Neuroverse
A podcast hosted by Clara.
and Carolina, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on individuality. So maybe we should start by talking a bit about what got us here.
Yeah.
So I think it started when I found this article about how forests, can migrate as a whole.
Yeah.
And I posted it on Twitter, or I retweeted it, and you replied saying that it reminded you of individuality because I was talking about how a whole forest can have sort of its own level of consciousness beyond an individual tree.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's what got us to discuss this topic.
Yeah, and I guess it also made me want to tackle the question, what is an individual?
Yeah.
And I guess different fields of study would call it different things. In biology, it's usually a unit of function. But there are a few other interesting theories out there. David Krakauer in Santa Fe Institute, he has a different notion of individuality, which was discussed in Quantas magazine as well.
Ooh.
And he proposes the information theory of individuality, which is instead of spatial terms, as we're used to, I occupy a certain space, I'm an individual, he thinks of it in temporal terms. So in terms of how information flows from the past to the future, and he thinks of everything as like a process. And we don't usually think of individuals as a process.
Yeah, because I think that would make it more difficult to define an individual.
Yeah.
If information is always flowing in time, because time is continuous. But actually that's interesting because, so I found David Hall is an American philosopher who apparently created the field of philosophy of biology.
Okay.
I didn't know before. And he defined an individual from a biological perspective as a spatial, temporally localized, cohesive, and continuous entity. And I agree with this definition because I think it's both in space and time that an individual must exist.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, I agree with that definition.
But I'm interested in this temporal information flow.
Yeah. I guess it's different from the way that we usually see things, but in a way it kind of makes sense because going back to my original question of when does something start and when does something end, like we have organisms living within our own bodies that we wouldn't survive without them, bacteria, and there are more bacterial cells in our bodies than our own cells, which is crazy to think about. But over time, you may lose or gain those cells. So I guess, in a way, it's kind of about the whole process.
So would you say that a human individual is defined by its composition in a particular moment in time?
Yeah, why not? I mean, it's difficult to draw hard boundaries in just spatial terms.
It's like this question, it reminds me of this famous example of if you have a boat and you take off a piece of the boat, like a wooden boat, let's say. You take off a piece of wood and then you replace it with another piece of metal. Yeah. And then is it the same thing? And then if you keep doing this, you'll eventually end up with a metal boat. Yeah. Versus an original wooden boat. So is it the same individual?
Yeah, that's
just so true in terms of, like, if you think of humans at a cellular level, like, we're constantly, shedding skin cells, and like you said, our microbiomes are constantly changing, and so biologically, our composition is different at different times in our lives. Yeah. Like, we're a totally different person by the end of our life compared to the beginning of our life.
Yeah. I know of the same theory or thought experiment, but in different ways, and that, like, if we keep substituting a part of our body that is malfunctioning with, like, a robotic part, at what point does it stop being human?
Yeah, yes, that's so true.
That kind of ties in with, like, the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which you've already mentioned, which is basically, in philosophy, there are two main different theories of, like, the self, either the psychological self or the physical self. So the physical self is what you've already mentioned, whether or not it's us in spatial terms, and over life we grow and we change, like our body grows and new cells regenerate. We are literally a different person from who we were yesterday because our cells have regenerated. But then, so you're left saying, okay, well then in that case, perhaps it's just a psychological self that remains, right? Like that's the constant.
Yeah.
However, there's also flaws with that because over time, temporal terms, we form new memories and it shapes who we are as a person.
Yes, I was just gonna say that. In this sense, like we are. The only constant we have is our memories. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, our memories are constantly changing.
Yeah.
There's such an inaccurate representation of the events that actually occurred, or, the initial memory.
Yeah, I was actually going to say that because, for example, if as a child something happened to our sibling, but later on in life, we internalize that and we think it happened to ourselves.
Yes.
Does it matter whether it did or didn't happen to you? Like, that's a pseudo-memory. That's like a memory that even though it didn't happen to you, you integrated that experience. So what is it about memory that actually matters? Is it the fact that you recollect it as your own?
In my opinion, it's how it influences you. Mm-hmm. So if you have that memory, it's going to influence your perception of yourself and therefore your future actions in a bigger sense of things. Also, it's really interesting that you mentioned this because we were just before recording talking about Oliver Sacks.
Yeah.
And I just finished reading Oliver Sacks' book, River of Consciousness, where he has a whole chapter on the falsibility of memories.
Yeah.
And describes his experience of having a memory. I can't remember exactly what it is now, but he had a distinct memory of something that had happened to him, and when he was older, he discovered that it was actually his brother's memory.
Oh, yes. Okay, so exactly, what we were talking about.
But because memories play such a big role in defining who you are, it still will affect you, despite whether or not it's accurate.
Yeah.
And in a way, none of our memories are accurate, because they're influenced by our state of mind at the time.
Yeah. Not only our state of mind at the time, but like our internal perception of the memory versus like external stimuli and how we interpret things. I can look at a mug and have a completely different emotional experience than you if perhaps the mug means something different to you. So even the way we integrate memories is completely different.
Yeah. Well, maybe I could say one thing I wanted to talk about was to what extent interactions between different entities influence the definition of what makes an individual.
Yes.
Which is sort of linked to what we're saying about integrating our own integration of memories. Because, so following the spatio-temporal theme, if two people are together spatio-temporally, they, in my opinion, from a human perspective at least, they still remain as two individuals.
Yeah.
And reflecting on this, it made me realize that what we perceive as individuals is dependent on our own definition of what is individual relative to ourselves.
Yeah.
Because we view ourselves as an individual, so we think of like two humans next to each other, we're like, oh, relative to me, that's two other humans, so they remain their own individuals.
Okay.
And this is also why it's super linked to what we define as what is a consciousness, which we can discuss further in another episode.
Yes. But yeah, good point. So, relative terms.
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And from our own perspective.
Yeah.
So, maybe what a cell, if it has its own consciousness, views as an individual is going to be very different to what a human views as an individual.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, that's very interesting. Because, so if a cell let's say that they are conscious and that they recognize other cells and that they consider them different individuals, then us as the human body, they would not consider us as the individual. And
yes, exactly. They would see us like how we view the universe.
Exactly.
In a way, because it's all a matter of levels.
Exactly.
Scales.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that also reminds me about a novel by. It's called Solaris, and it's by
Russian.
Yes. What's his name? Stanislav. And he basically talks about how the planet can be considered as an individual And it really stretches our imaginations because he also talks about the ocean potentially being sentient. And we, as humans, I guess we limit ourselves in what we may or may not consider an individual, again, because of our relative perspective on life.
Yes.
But why not? Why isn't the ocean an individual or even a sentient being, quote unquote? Because it contains so much life in it. It's a whole ecosystem.
Yes, and this brings us back to the original point of what brought us to this topic, which was, I do think that it is possible to view a forest as sort of an individual, because it ultimately, well, maybe I have more of a biological sort of functional perspective, because I love viewing things by their function. I think it's a very interesting way to look at things sometimes. And a forest carries out like an important function as an ecosystem, as a whole. And I mean, you can also extend that to like whole communities. I think humans have issues, especially in modern times, viewing communities as like their community as an individual beyond themselves. I mean, I guess it's this Western idea of individuality, individualism, I mean, rather than what is the word?
Communal?
Communitarianism? Communism!
Yes.
No, communitarianism is actually the philosophy that emphasizes connections between the individual and the community. And it's based on the belief that a person's social identity and personality are largely molded by its relationship with the community.
Yes.
Which I obviously agree with. But it's very difficult to, like, I think human thought is kind of, especially in the West, moving away from this as we view our worlds from such a, like, myself perspective, you know?
Yeah, that is true, but then democracy still kind of operates under that principle, you know? It's the majority that wins the elections, you know? And I guess that you can consider that as one individual.
Yeah.
Like, one party represents several people, and that one party, I guess, is the individual speaking for. Yeah. Going back to what you said about the trees and how the way that they function could be interpreted as an individual, that's interesting because it also, I think, ties in with mushrooms.
I knew you were going to say that.
And fungi.
I was just thinking mycelium networks.
Yes.
Yes, because they bind together the forest.
Yes. So mycelium networks are...
They're, I mean, I don't really know how
they're these networks
of fungi underground that in which electrical signals apparently pass between the trees to as a form of communication.
Yeah, and so it helps, in a way, it helps us see plants in a way that we've never seen them before. And Paul Stamets describes it very beautifully in his Netflix documentary Fantastic Fungi, where he talks about how if a mother tree is in connection with her offspring through these mycelium networks, it can tell when it's deprived from nutrients or when it's doing well, and through this it's able to communicate with other plants in their surroundings. And we'd never think that trees would quote unquote communicate.
I think it's amazing. I'm just so fascinated by that concept, and also as a neuroscientist I just love the connections that it has with how the brain works.
Neural networks.
Yes, neural networks, and the fact that they're also passed, they're obviously I think there are biochemical signals being passed underground, like they can send nutrients to other plants if other plants need it and if they have an excess in that sort of way. But they can also send electrical signals. Which I don't know much about, but it's insane.
And this also ties into David Attenborough's new documentary Green Planet, where in the first episode he talks about this specific mushroom called Leucogaricus, which is able to quote unquote communicate with ants. And this ant species is called Atacephalotes. And it does this by sending specific chemicals to the ants that allow them to know which leaves the fungi wants to eat. So they go out and they pick these leaves and they come back, give it to the fungi, and then you may be asking, all right, well, what is the benefit of having this relationship with the ant, and the mushrooms that this fungi produces feeds the ants. So it's this incredible symbiotic relationship.
Yes.
And that goes back to the question of what is an individual. In a symbiotic relationship, can you consider those as two separate individuals, or would it be one individual? Because without the other, they would not survive.
Yes.
So,
and this is similar to that if we saw two humans together, or like if we thought of a human and then the community that it lives in, like a human cannot easily survive without
a community.
That community.
Exactly. I was thinking that.
Yeah. Or beyond its human community, like, you know, the planet Earth that we live on, the food that we eat.
We're all dependent
that is so
on each
important.
other.
Yes, like, you know, we wouldn't survive without the nutrients that we receive from our food. And so how can we separate ourselves so easily from what we consume and what we live in and live on?
Yeah, like, it's a whole ecosystem, and I guess if one thing dies out, it has like such a catastrophic effect on all of the other quote-unquote individuals, you know? But yeah, symbiotic relationships, viruses, like...
Yes, viruses is a really good example. Like,
it depends on a host.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but I guess in some cases, some individuals, it's more clear how they depend on... how its survival depends on others, like a virus, symbiotic relationship. But humans, I guess, maybe it's not as in an extreme case, you know? As an extreme of a case.
For example, I was thinking of viruses and how, like, you know, COVID-19 didn't really exist until relatively recently.
Yeah.
And now it thrives in existence because of humans.
Yes.
And apparently some other animals too.
Yeah.
But then, so I guess that case is quite extreme because it's literal existence. If humans didn't exist, or if the host didn't exist, they wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
But whether or not something exists...
Does that count as an individual?
Yeah.
So I think that, again, relates to the spatial temporal topic.
Yes, I was thinking of the...
So...
I suppose it has to exist spatially or temporally or both in order to be an individual.
But is every individual, like, is existing enough to be considered an individual?
No, I don't think existence is enough to be an individual. Oh, wait. My mind is going in circles.
Yeah.
Existence is required for an individual to exist.
Okay. But are all...
Wait.
Is all existing things individuals?
Yes, this is the question. Well, that is the question I suppose we've been discussing.
Yeah. I guess things like, I don't know, wind? That wouldn't be considered an individual.
It's more...
Or an electron.
Or an electron.
Yes.
I had in my notes, is an electron an individual?
Yes.
I would argue not. Why would I argue not? I don't know.
I think...
because it's part of so many other individuals, it almost loses its own sense of individuality.
But isn't that the same thing as saying a cell isn't an individual just because it's within our human body and therefore it's relative to ourselves? Perhaps relative to other electrons, it's considered an individual.
Exactly. So I actually believe it can be an individual just at a different level.
Yeah.
But, you know, from our perspectives, for example, if you think of, like, water. Does water exist as an individual? But...
That's a good point.
It's a similar idea because water is everywhere. Like, water is in the air as humidity, as well as
it's
in water and ice and snow.
And you never have, like, one water particle. It's always just, like, you know, a mass of water.
Exactly.
You know?
I couldn't tell if you said a mass of water or a massive water.
No.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's just like, you always see water as an agglomerate, right?
Exactly. And it is literally everywhere. And so that sort of makes it, like, lose its sense of individuality because then it just becomes almost a concept, like a thing that exists. Yeah, so then I guess, yes, so existence definitely doesn't cause individuality to arise and arise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, anyways, to conclude.
I guess. Thank you for listening to our first podcast. Let us know what you think about it, and
yes.
We'll be covering other topics similar to this one in the near future.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed
our ramblings.
First episode. Our ramblings and confusions and going around in circles.
And if you have an opinion on individuality, let us know.
We'd love to hear it.
Yes. I think Spotify has this new feature where you can record your voice, so we'd love to hear your comments on it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.